emotional and relationship lives. So what he is doing, he thinks, is defending gays and all sorts of other groups, all what he would term non-traditional families and all this sort of thing. And he's not. He's creating a caricature enemy, which doesn't make the argument he pretends, in order to cloak himself in the beauty and grandeur of idealism, to cloak himself in the great raiments of ideology and sincerity. He thinks in his mind that he walks in the shoes of Martin Luther King and the suffragettes, and he isn't. He's a bad bureaucrat of the fourth-rate type.
Well, I think that is Nick Clegg fantastically well dispatched there, Douglas. I think we need to say no more on that subject. Now, before we move on to US politics and our wonderful, I think we should talk about our Restoration Weekend, don't you, Douglas, even though it's a few weeks ago now. I wanted to put in a brief ad, a reminder to listeners that subscription to Ricochet is only $3.58 a month. And for that, you get premium podcasts and the ability to create posts on member feedback and talk back to our great contributors, who include Peter Robinson, Paul Rea. Is it pronounced Rea? I never know. But he's a great writer. Paul Rea, James Delingpole, who he, Rob Long, and many, many more for $3.58 a month, price going up in January, so subscribe now. Anyway, I want to talk about our weekend of ecstatic conservative soundness in Florida at the Horowitz Restoration Weekend. I think you'll agree, Douglas, it was a pretty splendid occasion.
It always is, and it's incidentally never difficult to accept an invitation to it, because if you're sitting in rainy London and you get a call from someone in the US asking if you wouldn't mind coming to a beach resort in Florida for a weekend, it's the work of a moment to say yes. Yes, indeed. But I wrote a piece in The Spectator praising the sort of conservative values that were espoused at this weekend. And I really respect David Horowitz. I like the fact that he's a street fighter. I think we need our street fighters on the right, because I think sometimes there's a danger that we as conservatives can become, maybe complacent is the wrong word, but we lack the deviousness of the opposition in fighting our corners. I mean, you look at how, for example, thanks to the teachings of Gramsci, the left has captured all the institutions. You know, they've captured the universities, they've captured our schools, they've captured the publishing industry, they've captured Hollywood. Not that there was ever any difficulty there. They've captured the newspapers and so on. We conservatives, we tend to imagine that just because we've got right on our side, that we value empiricism, that we cleave to what is true, that this will be enough. And I don't think it is it? No, it's not. But there's another reason, of course, for this, which is that radical leftists don't have lives in the traditional understanding of it. They don't have a desire to pursue the ordinary things of happiness that the rest of us wish to pursue. They don't mind sacrificing every weekend to march down streets and holler the same empty slogans over and over again. And broadly speaking, people on the conservative side of the spectrum do try to pursue lives. They do try to find happiness in their relationships, in their families. They try to be part of their communities and so on. And they also tend, in my experience, not to be quite so fantastically closed-minded as the radical left. And you see no better example of that, by the way, than ever. I don't know about you, James, but whenever I've been on any demonstration for anything I would think of as a sort of conservative cause, and I've been on a few. I've hollered down a number of megaphones in my time to conservative comrades on streets and windswept corners. I've done it a bit. But, you know, the thing I've always noticed about it
is that Conservatives really don't like doing this. And they particularly don't like chanting the same slogan more than once.
Yes, you're right. I was on the countryside march a few years ago where people were protesting against the government ban on fox hunting and the general attack by Tony Blair's government on field sports and the countryside. Generally, it was all these metropolitan lovies picking on people who lived in the shires because they represented the Tory England that deserved to be destroyed. And you're right. I would say that the prevailing mood among the people participating in this march, and they'd come from all over Britain, many of them had walked hundreds of miles from the north. Some of them had never been to London before in their life, big town and all that. And the prevailing mood was one of embarrassment, I think, of self-consciousness. They didn't know what to do on a demo.
Yes, and they didn't want to create a scene. I made the very end of the countryside march you're talking about, and in fact, my main contribution was in the pub afterwards. But I do remember very distinctly exactly that sort of sense of people who just didn't really want to make a scene. They had political views, but by and large, they were I get on with my life, you get on with yours.
Yes,
and they didn't want to convert people, and they weren't sure how to anyway. And they certainly didn't have hatred in their hearts as their main motivation. They had a love in their hearts for the things that they wanted to protect. But of course, it's much harder to scream and holler about things you love than it is to scream and holler about things you hate. And by and large, I would argue conservatism is not a philosophy or political outlook to do with hatred. It's to do with love. It's to do with wishing to protect what is yours, which you believe you're a part of, and something you can call home. A radical leftism doesn't take that view. Its main motivation is to tear things down, not to protect, to alienate, not to make feel at home. And so these are two such different motivations that, of course, their outlook and their outcomes are also radically different.
Yes, and one of the things I've noticed about the left is that they project onto us conservatives the characteristics that they exhibit themselves. They project onto us the snarling hatred that actually the left represents. They say that we are the ones who don't care about people, when actually it's the left which wants to impose political systems on people which are alien to human nature. We are constantly accused of being, we on the right are constantly accused of being the nasty, uncaring people. But to me, that defines the kind of attitudes you see displayed by the left all the time.
No, quite. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So, one of the things I went to see the most fascinating speech by Baroness. Remind me.
Caroline Cox.
Caroline Cox, who came over from the House of Lords to give a speech about the threat of Islamism around the world, and this extraordinary, brave, plucky woman who has been threatened with death countless times. She's been on numerous trips to the Sudan at the peak of the Civil War, constantly being threatened with having her plane shot down by the Islamist government in Khartoum and so on. Happily still with us, fighting the fight. And one of the things she said in the course of an amazing speech she gave, I wasn't aware of this. You obviously are. There are currently operating in Britain, in parallel to our justice system, 82 Sharia courts. I mean, how does that happen? I thought, in Britain we were all equal before the law and there were no special separate courts for different communities. How did this happen?
Very important question. It happened in the following way, that a couple of decades ago now, something called the Arbitration Act was brought into law in Britain. I can't remember the exact year now. But it allowed mediation in civil disputes by certain religious and other courts. So, for instance, the Church of England had canon law. Jews were allowed the Beth Din, the courts of the Jewish tradition. There were other variants that had come up. I think there was one occasion when a Hell's Angel tribunal was assembled. I'd quite like to have seen that one.
No.
But the main point of the Arbitration Act was that if two adults volunteered to have a dispute arbitrated by an authority of their choosing, then as long as the process and the decision did not contravene the law of the land, then it could be, as it were, rubber stamped by the courts of the land. Now, this wouldn't, of course, be allowed to infringe on, for instance, a criminal matter. So if two people or two families were at loggerheads because one had murdered a member of the other or something, you wouldn't be able to have that arbitrated by anyone other than the courts of the land. But this was seen by the government of the day as being a good way to deal with the faith-based demands and others that existed. And by and large, it didn't have too many problems. If two businessmen had a dispute, but the law didn't need to get involved and it wasn't really a criminal matter or anything, then they could go to a wise council of men or women and take advice to settle the discussion and put themselves before that tribunal. Now, what was interesting was that, of course, this immediately was seized upon, or perhaps I should say gradually, because it took a few years, but in the long term, it was swiftly caught upon by advocates of Islamic Sharia ideology, and a number of courts were set up. It's far more, I think, than Caroline Cox says. I mean, we know of, I think, about 80-odd courts, but I'm in no doubt that there are many more. I wrote a piece a few years back, 2008, for the Times in London, about the presence of these Sharia courts, because I travelled around the north of England and various, effectively, ghettos, and interviewed women who had been subjected to rulings and judgments by these so-called courts. And I've been highlighting it for some years since, partly with Caroline and with many others as well, because what is astonishing about this is that a number of these Sharia courts, a number of years ago now, were found to have trodden beyond their allowance under the Arbitration Act and had actually stepped into criminal law. There were 6 cases, for instance, in one Sharia court alone of women who had been the subject of domestic violence, who had been told by the Sharia courts not to take the matter to the police because this was an Islamic matter, not one for the non-Islamic police. This is in complete contravention of the spirit as well as the letter of the law in the Arbitration Act. Now, this has been allowed to go on, and I think quite outrageously, because many people misunderstand what these so-called Sharia courts are, and particularly, if I can say so, outside the UK, where sometimes just bits of this story get picked up. You cannot still, in Britain, thankfully, have a Sharia court that orders someone stoning to death and you carry it out in the middle of Trafalgar Square. But you can, if you have, it seems, a backwards view of women's rights and a belief that a man should be able to beat a wife about if he wishes to, and the wife happens to be Muslim, you can, it seems, do all of this and protect such behaviour and not be a subject of any interest for the British police. And that is, to my mind, an absolutely astonishing part of this story that is simply not picked up upon enough, which is that, and I said this in this Times piece of some years ago, effectively it means that you have begun the process of a twin-track Britain, where you can imagine a future in which a girl born at 148 Acacia Avenue to non-Muslim parents grows up enjoying all the rights that all of her contemporaries do. And another girl at 150 Acacia Avenue who happens to have been born into a Muslim family who may decide to arbitrate things in their private lives according to Sharia would be judged throughout her life in a totally different way. And I think that is not just a tragedy. I